Order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We return to our inquiry today into the future of farming, and we will be focusing our attention this morning on the profitability review delivered last year by Baroness Bathurst. We are delighted to have Baroness Bathurst with us here this morning. Minette, just for the benefit of our own official record and for those who are following our proceedings, give us the edited highlights of your CV, who you are and what you do.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me in. So, Minette Bathurst, crossbench peer, former president of the National Farmers Union, farming myself as a tenant farmer on the Longford estate in South Wiltshire.
Good. Well, you are very welcome to the committee, and congratulations on delivering on time a very substantial and significant piece of work. Luke, you've spoken about the circumstances in which you took it on yourself. You said it did come with reputational risk. I'm sure we all heard it said, Department will never let her be independent. It will, she can't, this is a poisoned chalice. What on earth made you want to take this on?
Chairman, thank you. Well, I suppose having spent 10 years at the NFU, effectively trying to achieve farming profitability, and indeed, I guess if I look back further, that was what drove me to get involved in the NFU as a farmer myself. It seemed wrong not to accept Steve Reed's invitation to look at the challenges of farming profitability. I think I ought to sort of clarify that reputational damage. I mean, I wasn't remotely worried about my own reputation. What I was worried about was a lot of people saying, as you alluded to, Chairman, the report will be filleted, it will be changed, you won't be able to publish it in your own words. So all of that did make me slightly nervous, and I was very clear all along, both with Steve Reed and then when Emma Reynolds replaced him as Secretary of State, that if I was going to write this review, I would write it in my own words, and I would expect it to be published as is. And in fairness to them, they have always accepted that and indeed done that. So I am pleased. But that was the advice on reputation. It wasn't my concerns about myself. It was my concerns about the work.
Okay, profitability covers just about everything to do with farming. You've got issues around supply chain fairness, access to labour. You've got the challenges of climate change mitigation, the whole range of things, and you've recognised that, and you've come forward with something that could be able to meet these challenges. How much fit do you think DEFRA is as a department to juggle all these balls in the air at once?
I've said to DEFRA, and I think it's only fair, that they should have until June, effectively, to digest all of this and to come up with a plan that really sets out the 25-year farming roadmap. And that was my aim, really, to set out a process for how we start the farming roadmap across all sectors and focusing on farming rather than diversification. That was another thing that I was asked to look at, was diversification, and I was very keen to look at this. Must be about farming, and it must be about looking at profitability from farming enterprises. That doesn't just limit it to food production. But I didn't want my recommendations to be saying, well, farming is not looking profitable in some areas, so they should look at diversification. I think that is wrong. I think we want to be able to expect that farmers can earn a living and enough money to reinvest in a business. I'm under no illusions as to the major reset that this will be for the department and the major reset that it will be for the industry as well. This isn't just about government. If we are going to look to a comparison with New Zealand, with Ireland, with Denmark, with other countries that are working in partnership Partnership means both sides equally invested and working towards. That is not just about asking government, that is actually about rolling up our sleeves and developing this long-term plan for farming together. So it is a major reset. I've given 2 years for the turnaround, and in my opinion, on the evidence that I have, we don't have any longer than 2 years if we are not going to come up with a new economic model and a new strategy for a long-term farming roadmap that I would really like, and I hope to be able to talk to all political parties, because I think it's really important that we do have cross-party support. That doesn't mean to say some might do a bit more in some areas and a bit less in others, but I think what we've learned is that we cannot keep taking farming off of the road in parliamentary cycles. Mm-hmm. So the 25-year farming roadmap has got to set out a real need for the strategic change that I believe is needed. And it is as much a challenge to the industry and the supply chain as it is for DEFRA as a department. And it will need, and we'll come on to it, but at the moment I see competition between departments. You know, DBT and DEFRA are not aligned on the common cause. HMCLG, the challenges on planning, very clear for me to see that they don't deal with farming. So how can they have a Whitehall blueprint on planning? Mm-hmm. DEFRA needs to be streamlining that. So we need to look across departments to make this work as well, and DEFRA will need support from other departments to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come on to the question of the roadmap in a second, but I think, first of all, on your point about not considering diversification, that's very important just for the credibility and getting a hearing from within the farming industry itself. But the relationship between farming communities and DEFRA is poor and has been for quite some time. One of the first things we did as a committee, we had the former Permanent Secretary and a couple of senior officials in to give evidence in January, following which we did as a committee write, and I'll just read back our observations at that time. It is my committee's view that the departmental officials were not sufficiently alive to the urgency of providing certainty for farmers who must necessarily plan many years ahead. The government must set out a coherent and signposted plan for change with details of the risks posed and the support available to farmers. We urge you to set out the programme's direction of travel as a priority and at the latest before harvest 2025. We are still we're almost a year to the day since that letter went, and we're still waiting for the farming roadmap. So how do you see the prospects, with your profitability review, of resetting that relationship between department and industry?
I don't think we should underestimate the Herculean challenge that is, and actually DEFRA's own evidence base tells us that. You know, the fact that less people understand the government plan, the ELMS proposal now, than when it started speaks volumes, and that was less than 10% then, and now it's down to 7% that actually understand what the government plan is. I was very clear that DEFRA needs to be talking to many more farmers, and that is in the recommendation in the agri-growth hubs and also the catchment approach. There is not a relationship with the farmers on the ground at the moment, which is why so many do not understand what the plan is. Now, you could say, well, there hasn't been a coherent plan. You've only got to look at the number of Secretary of States that we've had, you know, on average one every year. And that has led to enormous challenges as well. So in many ways, you could say that we don't start this from a very good place, but actually we start it with pretty much a blank canvas from which to operate from. And I have to say, as a farmer myself, having started with a great degree of sort of almost fear and trepidation about the impossible nature of all of this, by the time I finished it and was writing my conclusions, I actually thought this is very exciting. You know, we really, really can have a very different industry. We should recognise that many countries across the world have been focused on establishing trade deals with the UK because they want to have access to this market. They see it as one of the most prized food markets in the world. I think we are here within this marketplace and not actually recognising what we have here. So I saw it as a huge opportunity and very exciting.
The recent changes to inheritance tax, you touched on this in the report. Does that help with the reset, do you think?
Massively. In fairness to the Prime Minister, in fairness to the Chancellor, they have both seen me, they have both engaged, they have looked at this evidence and the plan. The Prime Minister has said he's very keen to see this plan happen. I think it allows us to start afresh. I talk about the fear and trepidation of the industry facing into this and what it would mean. And the evidence is clear. You've only got to look at the independent analysis to see that over 50% of farms fall below the level of median household earnings. If we're looking at the average family farm of 140 hectares, they need to be having a profitability margin of 34,500 to be on a comparison with median household earnings. And I think it was a very stark fact that over 50% of farm businesses fall below that. There is, I think, enormous nervousness from my point of view that the mid-performing farming businesses are fragile right now. And that's why I say 2 years, because I don't believe we have much longer than that if we want to save the farming structure that we've got in this country. So I think it's good that the IHT situation has been resolved. Not everybody is happy, and I think there will be expectations in a future government to see the end of this. But what we have at the moment, I think, is a recognition of where farming is. What we must do now is to work to the solutions to resolve the whole situation and to be ambitious, especially in the geopolitical situation that we have now. There's a lot of recommendations here about bringing food production into this plan. And, I think there is no one silver bullet. I kept on saying it, and I've been challenged on the number of recommendations. 57, I strongly believe that all 57 need to happen. I put a lot of thought. I'd hoped to get it into the 30s, but I couldn't. But, if we look back 20 years ago to the Curry Commission, you had well over 100 recommendations. We were members of the European Union then. We must accept, I think, that this plan has been done in light of there not being a plan for farming. Since we left in 2020. So it's had to cover off other things that it wouldn't necessarily have done in other circumstances.
Right. Now, I want to look then at the relationship between your review and the coming farming roadmap. First of all, the question of support for food production and food security. One of the questions I asked the Director General for Food Biosecurity and Trade when she appeared before us in December was around the inclusion of livestock numbers. You'll know livestock numbers have been on a steep downward decline, and I asked if there was any prospect of that being something that would be addressed in the farming roadmap. She said, I would be surprised if we ended up talking about livestock numbers in the farming roadmap. I think what needs to be set out, and I asked her then, why would this surprise you? And she said, just because where ministers have been over the last few years, that has not been a typical view from DEFRA. So essentially, no, we're going to have this big strategy, but it's not going to be informed by something like a view on how big the national herd, the national flock should be. Does that seem like a sensible way of progressing to you?
The fundamental focus of this review is joining up the plan that individual farmers are making on farm with the national plan. And that is what needs to happen. The decisions that I am making as a farmer, I need to know what the national plan is. A vast proportion of this country is livestock production. The uplands are not going to be growing broccoli or malting barley or milling wheat. They are predominantly livestock based, and we need to know what the plan for those businesses is. And I talk about developing sector missions, and I think that is really important, that all sectors develop the sector missions. And we must be very careful here not to tie up consumption with production. You know, what we're not consuming here, we should be ambitious to export. And I talk about growing our exports 30% by 2030. That needs a coordinated plan. I was always really struck when the New Zealanders came here. They'd all turn up, farmers with the government delegation, wearing their black fleeces with their silver ferns, saying, on exports, these are the three things that we need to talk to you about. And we have to be doing the same thing. So, of course, we must know our livestock numbers. We must know absolutely sector by sector what we are producing and where we need to be ambitious. And I talk about, you know, the plan for growth. We must be growing domestic production, and there are many reasons for doing that, but we must do it in measurable terms. So the situation with dairy at the moment, why I think market monitoring is so important, is that we've got to know what is coming into our marketplace, what we are producing here, because we've got to make those plans to be set out across the four areas of retail, out-of-home and manufacturing, government procurement and exports. So we've got to know what's coming in. We've also got to know what we've got, to your point on livestock numbers.
Well, you mentioned dairy there. Now that's the most obvious and acute issue around farming profitability at the moment, because you've got a market glut which is driving down the price. That will eventually correct itself, I have no doubt. But in the meantime, we risk losing a substantial number of dairy operations within this country, which again has been a historic direction of travel in recent decades. We've got no basic payment left, unlike other parts of the United Kingdom and the European Union and elsewhere in the world. To what extent did that inform your thinking about your comments on SFI and how that could be used to deliver food production as well as environmental benefits?
We heard a lot in the last Parliament about this being a global first, and it is a global first. No other country in the world has gone purely down the environmental route. I believe it is absolutely essential now that we do bring food production into the SFI, and we can deliver, and must recognise we can deliver public good benefits, both for the environment, nature, soil and food, by doing that. This is not an either or. We've had a lot of warm words over many years about food and the environment being treated as two sides of the same coin. We've failed to act on that. So I think it's essential that we bring food into that, but we can still be looking at the environmental benefits of those crops. So I talk about peas, beans. We should be aiming to be soya free in 10 years' time. We're importing a vast amount of soya that is doing, in some cases, environmental harm in other countries. We can change all of that. If I look at Kenya, a country that I've spent a bit of time in, yes, they have a massive plan for tree planting, but they focus on food-producing trees that obviously sequester carbon but deliver a crop as well. So it's really to our detriment, I think, that we have excluded food, and we must incorporate it now. And I think there are other reasons for doing that. You know, if we just continue to focus on environmental crops. For farmers, you know, I'll come on to it, but I talk about mandating the Task Force for Nature Disclosures. We don't have enough money. I was working with a 2007 budget, if you factor in inflation. So we're working with a vastly diminished budget. And I think the situation now with defence spending, the NHS, it is unlikely that DEFRA is going to get more taxpayers' money. which means that allowing a farm business to be truly profitable by food-producing crops as well is going to be essential.
How worried do you think we should be about the position of the dairy sector at the moment?
I think it's enormously concerning what has happened in dairy, and it's why market monitoring is so important. You know, we have a huge population, 70 million people on an island. We can't be importing liquid milk, but it is very easy for a country like ours to go into oversupply, and then we always see, you know, the ramifications of what comes out of that are stark, and we lose businesses on the back of it. And that's why we've really got to manage the supply and demand model much better than we have done. In Europe, they have done it for us. Regardless of alignment, we are an independent nation now, and we have to be in control of what we are producing, what the home market wants, and what we should be exporting. And if we don't change, we will continue to get more challenges like we've seen in the dairy sector. The fundamental first rule with agriculture is that you manage supply and demand, because you're dealing with a fresh product. You can't just say, well, actually, we're just going to store this. I mean, which is why, of course, Ireland and other countries have invested so much in drying facilities to then be exporting milk powder. You know, we have to be doing the same thing.
Is this the sort of thing you think that your Farm Advisory Board would be able to tackle?
Yeah, there are two platforms effectively, and a lot of this thinking is modelled on Ireland with the Borbia Food Board and Teagasc, which effectively Teagasc is about technical advice for farmers, but also science and research. And that was how it started, with a research platform and their equivalent of ADAS, effectively, advisory, coming together. And I believe we should do the same. And at the moment, if you look at advice, you know, it is in about 40 different places for farmers. I would love to see DEFRA have one dashboard, a one-stop shop with everything that a farmer needs, so they don't have to go to all of these different places for advice in the future. And also research. We should be very, very excited about the opportunities that we have on the sector missions for developing the research priorities, but also at a national level.
Hogged the limelight for long enough. Sarah, you wanted to come in with a quick question, and then we're going to Sarah Bull.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Morning, Minette. Thank you very much. Just going on to further on dairy, there's been an awful lot of butter and cheese that's come through from Australia and America over the course of the last few months. This has obviously really pushed the price down significantly, because there's an oversupply now, and many dairy farmers are producing for way less than the cost of production. It looks like prices might go down a little bit more. What's your feeling on the trade deals and the impact of the trade deals on this cyclical market that we've got in milk at the moment, but also the importance of point of origin labelling as well, because a lot of these products are coming in without that labelling. That is then undermining the UK market, and consumers are almost being duped into thinking that they're buying British when they're not. Absolutely.
So a couple of things here. If I pick up the labelling point first, we tend to focus all of our attention on retail. Obviously, you have labels in retail, and indeed retail has absolutely embedded country of origin labelling. It is different in the out-of-home sector, whereby not even the voluntary code on country of origin applies to the out-of-home sector, which is about 50% of the value of the food market. So I recommend that we should, at the very first instance, apply the voluntary code to the out-of-home sector, and I think that should look to a statutory embedding so that the consumer knows that what they are buying is actually what they are buying. There's nothing at the moment, and this isn't about further cost for the out-of-home sector that is really, really struggling at the moment. This is about transparency, honesty, integrity. Because equally in retail, we are seeing misuse of the Union Jack, and I also recommend that if the Union Jack is going to be used, it should be used on products that have been grown or reared and produced in this country. It should not be used on products, raw ingredients that have been imported, processed here, and then are badged up with a Union Jack to mislead the consumer into thinking they are buying a British product. So the Union Jack, in my report, should be linked to assurance schemes like Lionmark, Laid in Britain, Red Tractor, where it provides clear proof that it has been produced here. So we need a complete overhaul, particularly in the out-of-home sector, whereby anecdotally, admittedly, but I was told that probably only 1 in 16 steaks is actually a British Aberdeen Angus steak. So we are seeing a lot of misuse of British, and that leads on to your point of impact of trade deals. You know, we have signed a trade deal with India. We are going to see India become SPS compliant. And we must be very mindful here that SPS and SPS alignment with Europe does not represent food values. So food values are legislation and regulation on animal welfare and environmental protection. SPS is about food safety. And those are two different things. So the point of difference with what we are expecting our farmers to produce to and the legislation and the regulation of our farmers as opposed to others where we're importing from, we have to have that point of difference. And we have to know, and this is why the market monitoring becomes so important. At the moment, market monitoring is all over the place. It's in different places. HMRC have some, AHDB have some, the NFU has some. You have one person in DEFRA looking at market monitoring. It's got to be centralised. So all of this data is an accessible format, and we are acting on that data. So as we import more, we are going to be needing to look at exporting more to balance that very fragile supply and demand model. And this is why I talk about the 2 years, because if we don't, we're going to have a lot more product coming onto our market, of which we don't know how much or when. Don't forget, and it's easy to forget, it was a fully liberalised deal with Australia, fully liberalised. So they will have open access. And, you know, in the upended world market that we have at the moment, we will see more product coming on. So it is fundamental to profitability. You know, it is the most important thing. And, you know, I don't expect to see misuse of the Union Jack in the way that we have seen it.
Yes, some of my fellow countrymen would, of course, point out at this stage that other flags are available. Flags, eh? Sarah.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a separate question, just to start it. Was there, because you've obviously got vast experience, was there anything that surprised you when you were doing this review?
A lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot, really. I was surprised at, I guess, the dysfunctionality of government departments. I was surprised at the competition between them. And I think the more I looked into it and the more I understood it, the more I realised that actually it's set up to work in a European situation. It's not set up to work independently. And I think the other concern I've had, you know, this was a profitability review for England, but I was really mindful that we are 4 nations, 1 country. And I'm enormously grateful to Scotland, to Wales and Northern Ireland, who all welcomed me in. And a lot of these recommendations are UK-wide. So it surprised me as well that, you know, having spent so much time out in Europe engaging, you know, with 27 member states, I'm in fear that we are headed for more complexity with the UK 4 than we had with the EU 28. So we've got to make sure this internal market works as well as possible. And that means, you know, the continuing respect of the devolved relationship. But where necessary, and particularly on trade, on disease, biosecurity, we have to have a joined-up plan. And equally with the policy, you know, at the moment we are headed for serious divergence with England and Scotland and Wales, all connected in one island. And at the moment, that's why I talk about bringing food production back in, why I talk about the active farmer principle, and I'm using the wording from our own Agricultural Act, because we've got to have a common approach. I talk about the principles of the Common Agricultural Policy. This island needs to establish principles and framework in order from which to operate. So politics must be, I think, respective of the wider importance of making sure that we have a plan for rural.
Interesting. No, it's fascinating. Back to what I should be asking about, sorry, because I'm supposed to be doing on the process. But you mentioned earlier on, obviously, you didn't want to talk about diversification to improve viability because you want to focus on pure profitability, which I can sort of understand, but that's almost like saying I'm going to buy a house, but I'm not going to look at the mortgage element of it because it seems quite crucial. So we just wanted to say, how realistic is it to be able to get that improved profitability if we're not going to consider in your report the diversification?
It was more the challenge of time.
Okay.
I was given 6 months, and 6 months to engage with the whole industry, ask the industry effectively, sector by sector, what are the 3 blockages, and I was very keen to challenge them on the solutions. I would have needed longer to have done it well. I say at the end in my conclusions, there are regrets. I would have liked to have spoken to more young people, because I do think there's a real difference in young people's plans for the future and my generation's thoughts on the future, and we should be allowing young people a really strong voice in all of that, but also on biosecurity and disease. I made the point there that actually that is another review in itself. And diversification, I felt that was another review. I would have diluted my recommendations, and I still stand by the fact that it isn't for every farming business to diversify. Some have. My own business is a diversified business, but for some, it's not a possibility, and it's not something that potentially that farm business would be suited to doing. So I still think it was right to explore the challenges for farming and what profitability means for that sector. And if the government chooses to look at diversification on the back of this, that will be a choice for them. I think it would have muddied the waters.
But also the review doesn't include recommendations on reducing input costs directly. I assume, was that also time, or was there other factors? Because obviously we have to look at the cost of fertilisers, pesticides, energy costs. But again, it didn't address that, so we're just wondering why.
Well, it addressed the costs.
Yes.
So if we're looking at our fixed costs, the OBR was predicting last year that there's 30% rise in input costs, fixed costs exactly the same. They're marching stride for stride. New machinery up 31% from where it was in 2019. These are enormous costs. In living memory, we haven't seen, that those price hikes in such a short period of time. And we know why. Leaving the European Union, COVID, inflation started to rise, and then the final challenge of a war in Europe has driven a coach and horses through it. So we're dealing with enormous challenges in those costs. It's very hard to put in a flaw or indeed a recommendation that deals with that. If we look at how we are structured with competition law, we are not actually enabled to intervene like they do in the US, and I make reference to that. And that's why I think that we need to look at a new economic solution to build resilience at a farm level. And, that makes it very clear that, we have to be looking at a profit margin of £250 per hectare if we're going to be remotely there. There are other factors, long-term contracts. We are seeing now the supply chain very much look towards a long-term relationship. Pilgrims coming out talking about 20-year contracts. Who would have thought that was going to happen 10 years ago? We need the same approach from government now, a long-term plan. 3 years is not long-term, and it doesn't allow for those long-term investments that are needed. So I think it's a challenge to what we do about input costs, but there are other things that we can give certainty on, that we can, manage to to cope with the enormous volatility that we're facing into now. And there are multiple reasons for that volatility, geopolitics, weather, the fact that we deal with global commodities and we don't have control of end price. So there are lots of different challenges that we face, and what I'm trying to focus on is, how do we build resilience? How do we manage volatility? A lot of that, again, on managing volatility goes back to market monitoring. A big push from a lot of the evidence that I had was wanting to understand fertiliser pricing, was wanting to know what flows of grain there are within the UK market, what is coming onto our market, what we're exporting. Farmers don't have that knowledge at their fingertips at the moment. They need much more knowledge to join up that national plan with that individual plan on farm.
And just, because I think we've got a lot more questions coming on, but just finally, obviously you've done a huge amount of work and we very much appreciate all of that. I think we were all a little bit disappointed that it only got released just before Christmas, and I think the Minister said to us it was the number 10 grid that was controlling that. Do you think it shows any attitude that the government has towards that, or do you think it really was just the number 10 grid that stopped it from coming out?
I absolutely think it was. There's so much talk of conspiracy at the moment. Dare I say it, it is nearly always cock up. I know DEFRA were disappointed. I know Emma Reynolds was very keen to have it published straight away. I worked very hard. Steve Reed was quite happy to give me longer into November, the end of November. Emma Reynolds wanted it on her desk by the 31st of October. So I worked very hard to get it over the line by the 31st, and they wanted it published, I wanted it published, and it was very frustrating that it took a while, but I had to and did understand that 20 departments in the run-up to the end of the year, a lot of departments are saying, we have to get this published. And so probably all roads lead back to Alistair Campbell establishing the number 10 grid.
Thank you very much.
And the days running up to Christmas turned out to be a lot busier for many of us, as it turned out. Juliet, you're going to lead the questioning in relation to the findings.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for attending today. So the response from the farming industry has been broadly positive. The focus is now on how DEFRA will implement the recommendations. In your report, you've made it clear, and you've said today, that there's no silver bullet to improve profitability. Of the recommendations you made, which should the government prioritise?
Oh, that is a very, very difficult one to answer. They've committed to the partnership board. So let me focus on that, because they've committed to that already. I still stand very strongly behind 57 recommendations are needed to start the process. The partnership board, though, is an important first step, but it's not a new idea. And what we must do is learn lessons, and particularly from the Food and Drink Sector Council that was set up by Theresa May for the industrial strategy. Now, in that time, other sectors, the automotive sector, aerospace, other sectors of our economy, all came up with a plan to be part of the industrial strategy, and they are part of the industrial strategy. Food and drink didn't come up with anything, and that is a travesty. And that is what has to change, which is why I talk about the balanced scorecard approach to do this in measurable terms. And the fundamental first step, I still believe, is recalculating the value of the sector. I think it's been enormously damaging over many years that we are perceived to be 0.6% of GDP. And I've had conversations in the past with the Treasury and with DEFRA officials whereby they've said farming couldn't matter less. It's 0.6% of GDP. It's not important. And to which I would always follow up with, well, what about all the foreign businesses that are here because the raw ingredients are grown here? But that's only the first step. You then look at the machinery dealerships, the farm vets, the agronomists, the schools, the pubs in rural areas. I make the point that, who's going to clear the roads in winter? Who's going to put out the wildfires in summer? Farming is integral to the rural economy, but nobody understands in Whitehall what it is. And that's not particularly their fault. That's many, many years of not understanding what it is. And there's evidence in other countries, in New Zealand, whereby 80% of the value of primary production comes from other areas. So if we recalculate that figure with the ONS, which is what my first ask of DEFRA, you will have a very, very different figure that I think will make the Treasury think, oh, gosh, this is actually quite an exciting sector, and this can be very much about growth and wealth creation.
So what do you think that figure would be?
The irony for me is I hoped while I was doing the work that we could work it out. We couldn't. And that is extraordinary in itself, that we don't know the value of all the businesses that are here that are involved with the raw ingredients. Other countries could tell you that. New Zealand could tell you that. Ireland could tell you that. We can't. And that shows you actually why we need to do it. Because this is about jobs. This is about jobs in very rural places. We look at all the challenges and opportunities with AI. I think there'll be a lot of opportunities for jobs in the food supply chain on the back of this. But we've got to know. That's the point. So that's why we've got to re-establish the true value. And I could have recommended that farming went into DBT, because DBT deals with businesses. DEFRA deals with farming businesses. So this is why it's so important to have the focus on primary production, because nobody else has that focus on these businesses. But then we need to join it up with DBT so that we are focused on UK raw ingredients. Now, I remember very much in the last Parliament, having conversations. I can remember having a conversation at the Food and Drink Sector Council where Liam Fox actually said, the great opportunity of Brexit is to bring in cheap raw ingredients and add value to them under the Union Jack. That was the line that was used. We have got to focus on UK-grown raw ingredients. And that's why it's important that we do this in measurable terms and we join up across those 4 markets I talked about at the beginning. That's probably up there with the most important things that DEFRA needs to do. But it isn't about just establishing a board. It's about establishing a board that delivers the right outcome. And it can't do that unless it is set up in the right way at the beginning to do this in measurable terms. Otherwise, what happened at the Food and Drink Sector Council will happen again, and you will have people sitting around the table saying, the government should, the ask is, and it will turn into a talking shop or a lobby all over again.
If the board is set up correctly, what impact do you think the board will have?
Well, it should be able to grow our exports 30%. 2030 might be a bit of a tough ask, but it should be aiming to do that. The out-of-home sector, we have no idea what the out-of-home sector wants. If you talk to the out-of-home sector, I put in some case studies. Ascot Racecourse, actually not just doing the catering for Ascot, but doing catering for quite a lot of different venues. They did the catering actually in Ireland for the Ryder Cup. So they were very interesting to look at their sourcing, and actually they have very strong commitment to British sourcing. But many of them that I spoke to, the wholesalers, were saying, we have no idea what is being produced in this country, let alone what to buy. In most European countries, wholesale sits above retail. In the UK, retail sits above wholesale. So retail has the first, it has the lion's share of what we're producing. But that doesn't mean to say we can't look to grow our domestic production for the out-of-home sector, for the manufacturers. When I talk about protein crops, we should be producing much more of our protein here. We should be aiming to be soya-free in the next 10 years. We know that there is a demand for more plant-based proteins. The Food Foundation talking about more peas and beans. Well, that should be part of the SFI.
Got another 2 for you. So, what was your experience of working with DEFRA? And do you believe that it has the resources, the capability and the appetite for reform needed to significantly improve farm profitability?
So when I first started, I was given a very small team of 5. You've had oversight of the Cunliffe review. Cunliffe had 40 people working on that review. I had 5. I had 5 people, only one of whom knew anything about farming. And so I thought at the beginning, this is going to be impossible. When I got to the end, I can honestly say that that team of 5 were all experts. And I was learning as much from them. They were challenging me as to what wasn't in there, what should have been in there. And so I was really proud of them. And everywhere I've been, I've thanked them and talked about what they achieved. And what it proved to me was that, these were bright young people. Bright young people can turn their hand to anything when they are tasked with the right direction. And so they pretty soon picked it up. And if they picked it up, anybody in DEFRA can pick it up. But what is missing is the coordination. And, I think it is a department that was very much set up in Michael Gove's time. The world was completely different then. Our world has changed beyond all recognition since that Green Brexit announcement in 2016. And the department has to adapt. The funding that I talked about, 2007 budget, has to become an economic department. It really does need to change at pace. So there is pressure on it. It's not of its own fault. And the people, our civil service is bright and people go into the civil service to achieve. But what they need is a coordinated plan from which to operate from. And that is what is missing, I think.
So there is an appetite, it just needs to be delivered in a different way.
The deliverability, and that's where you need to bring, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but Paul Kissack, the new permanent secretary in DEFRA, said to me, I was really struck by what you said about civil servants going out. I have to say, to start off with, I said they should be sleeping in the lambing sheds, and then I decided that was better to change that and say they should be helping in the daytime in the lambing sheds. But what I was trying to establish was you've got to get out of Whitehall. You've got to get out to understand. Equally, farmers have got to come in. So you've got to have change on both sides of understanding and working and developing together. Not this sort of continual, I would say, in some cases on both sides, sort of writing of press releases. This is about developing a long-term strategic plan together. And I think that integration, we used in the past to have a lot more secondments out into the sector. None of that happens now. We've got to get back to doing that.
Thank you.
There are some of us for whom being helpful and being asleep are not always necessarily a different thing when it came to the lambing shed. I was really struck me, you've got it there. I'm convinced that civil servants need to get out in farms, helping in the lambing shed or spending a day picking fruit, and farmers need to work with them. We need to plan much more together how we shape the future of food and farming. Yeah. Strong words. How likely do you think it is to happen?
Well, as I say, Paul Kissack, the new Perm Sec in DEFRA, said those were the words he was most struck by. So I think he's very much committed to wanting to establish a new relationship with farmers. Mm-hmm. And I thought that his commitment to those words was very, very positive indeed.
Oh. I might even have a vacancy for him in a few weeks' time. We're moving on then to the fourth section, which the questioning is going to be led by Josh on the ELM schemes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Baroness Batters, for coming and speaking to us. Thank you for your review. I think it is genuinely a really useful blueprint that particularly those of us as backbenchers can kind of hold the government to account on. So thank you very much for all your work. As you referenced earlier, England's transition from basic payments to public money purely for environmental goods has been controversial, and it's fundamentally changed the relationship between farmers and the government, particularly in light of the early closure of the SFI. In your discussions, what sense did you get of how well ELM schemes are supporting the farming sector and profitability, and what improvements do you think the government needs to make in their revised SFI offer?
So, right from the beginning, I was, don't forget when I went in, was about the time that the SFI was being shut. I think that was a real shock and a real concern to Steve Reed and Daniel Zeitner at the time. If I'm honest, and you have to look back, I think it was set up in totally the wrong way. If you have a scheme that is open-ended and demand-led, you have no idea what the demand will be, so you have no idea of the value that will be demanded. So you can understand why the Treasury would be enormously frustrated by a scheme like that. And then to come into government without the knowledge of this scheme could run out of money, and of course in the desire in the last Parliament to get the money out the door, the payment rates were raised. So a lot of people then did come forwards, but because again it was demand-led and you didn't know what the demand would be, the money disappeared very quickly. So in many ways it was set up to fail. But it is, I think, the SFI can be a really good scheme. And it is the scheme. So we've got to now make it work. But we don't have enough money. You know, the NFU work showed that we needed, if we were going to be compliant with the environmental legislated targets, deliver all of the outcomes that are required of farmers, we'd need a budget of 4 billion. And I don't see personally that amount of money, with the challenges that this country faces, the debt that this country has, I don't see that money coming forwards. So we've got to look at a new economic model, which is why I talk about the soil shot programme for building our soil health, but also, again, not putting all of the burden and the cost onto farmers. You know, this really fundamentally goes back to the polluter pays principle. If you've removed BPS, if you've removed all payment that effectively has covered off our risk over the years, you can't expect farmers to carry that cost. But equally, you don't want to drive food inflation. So you've got to make this as broad and fair as possible, which is why I think that, you know, you can have the approach on climate change and emissions effectively, which is legislated. And I mean, people will have different views, but my terms of reference were specific to climate change legislation and regulation and net zero objectives. So I had to work within that framework. So that's why I recommend establishing the Soil Shot programme, and why I talk about the Task Force for Nature Disclosures being mandated. This is a very, very exciting thing, I feel, to do, because at the moment BNG is very narrow and very costly and is holding back a lot of infrastructure projects. We know that for the financial institutions and the corporate sector, they have to be and are voluntarily responding on the nature disclosures. So government has all the answers here, because government has effectively the ability to offer high integrity, as it has done with BNG, the Woodland Carbon Code, within the BSI standards. If nature can be embedded as a fundamental national asset, you have the integrity, farming gives you the scale, and farming giving you the scale is what makes it affordable. But this gives you your new economic model. So it could be distributed by the RPA, as is currently the case. You could go down the catchment approach that I've recommended. But we've got to look at this new economic model. Now, that frees up all the challenges on infrastructure as well. And you can bring in trees, hedges, you know, herbal lays deliver a nature benefit. Cover crops, you know, our fields this autumn have been alive with phacelia, buckwheat. You know, it's been a fantastic nature benefit. So if we want to retain the family farm structure that we've got to have a new economic model. And that is why I propose establishing this task force. Now, Emma Reynolds is very, very well placed to lead this, because, of course, she ended the green taxonomy when she was in the Treasury, because that became very much a standard of how to farm. We need more flexibility for farms in England. But this could then work as a budget UK-wide, and it would be a global first, and I think it could be really transformative.
Do you think that, again, we've been talking about kind of complexity for particularly small farms around capacity within DEFRA to do this. Do you think there would be the capacity to deliver that new model alongside potentially very different SFI as well, kind of all coming this year? Do you think that's something that, again, other departments are going to have to assist with? It's going to have to be a whole government effort?
No, I think it would simplify it enormously, because you don't need 100 plus options. You need enough options, and DEFRA does know, has a good evidence base now of actually the bulk of the options that have been pulled down and what they have achieved. If you bring in the protein crops, the pulses, the oil seeds, we've banned neonicotinoids in this country, but we are mixing what we are producing here with countries that haven't banned them. So we really should be looking on our own country and what we are producing. And I mean, you would never see that happening with olives in Greece, as an example. It just wouldn't happen, or Italy or anywhere else. So we've really got to look at what we're producing and how we add value to this. But the deliverability has got to be much more simplified on what it was before, so that we know effectively what the budget is, what it is being spent on. I mean, I was shocked, when I originally spoke to Paul Caldwell at the RPA about the costs of delivering the SFI as opposed to the costs of delivering the land-based payment. You had an enormous change in personnel. So the simplification is really, really important to deliver the benefit to the taxpayer. And that was an important point for me. I could have written a great review for farmers that would have sat on a shelf. So it was really important this review worked for government priorities, taxpayers, consumers, and farming profitability.
Yeah, okay. So you have recommended that some elements of agri-environment schemes should be linked back to food production. You referenced earlier the pushback that some of your recommendations have had, and I think it's fair to say that's one of them. I know it's something that you were asked about on Farming Today, for example. To what extent do you think that could undermine the environmental aims of ELMS? That's what some people are saying. What's your response to that?
There might have been pushback, but I haven't had it directly to me. So
I'm scared.
So
almost like they're scared.
I mean, I don't underestimate. I think this committee has a really important role in implementation and delivery. I effectively am one person, and almost I've done the work, and I have to step back now. The last thing anybody wants is me sort of griping from the sidelines. So I think you have a really important role, a critical role in establishing this. I'm not talking about, subsidising in a way that we saw subsidised in the past. I'm talking about crops that deliver double benefit, food producing benefit and environmental benefit. I don't think there's any problem with that. All I'm saying is this is a moment. If we don't change, 2 years' time, you're going to start to see a very, very different farming sector. Do we want large-scale monoculture farming operations? Who wants that? If they want it, well, yes, you're on a road to getting that. If you don't want it, you need to change, and you need to put these recommendations in place.
I think it's fair to say that we've seen since the closure of the SFI and the farms that weren't able to get into it, what happens when we don't have an effective scheme, which we've seen is losses for farm profitability as well as nature. So I think for me that underscores a lot of the points that you're making. Just on some of the sort of more ambitious schemes like higher tier countryside stewardship, landscape recovery, clearly they are delivering on an environmental level, and I think a lot of the partnerships that have been formed around them are really fascinating and really effective. But some people have complained that, particularly for smaller farmers, they're difficult to get into, they're quite bureaucratic. Did you look at that as part of your review? How do you see those sort of schemes that are still going to be there kind of operating in the future?
So I had an opinion on them, but I was told not to get involved in them.
Okay.
But I did have an opinion, and I do have, I think, a very important opinion. In the last Parliament, it was made very clear, and you heard Michael Gove say many times, the cap had been very unfair. You had large payments going to wealthy landowners, and it should be different. We are seeing exactly the same play out now. The larger you are, the bigger recipient you will be. And that's, in my opinion, wrong from what the initial aim was. Landscape recovery projects are great if you're in one. If you're not, What is there? And so what I have recommended is landscape recovery across all of England. And that is what we need. And what I see more and more and more of is what I would call diamonds in paper crowns. You've got these diamond projects surrounded by a paper crown. And that is wrong. And I think it's particularly wrong for a Labour government to be really focused on, there is another challenge here around decision making. The National Trust is a very, very large landowner. We are seeing large landowners pulling down huge sums of public money. The decisions that are being made are made by those large landowners, not the tenant. And that's why I think that we should look at the new Commissioner, Alan Laidlaw, having similar powers to the Grocery Code adjudicator, so that tenant farmers, of which we've got nearly 50% of farmers in England are tenants, they should be allowed to have a say in all of this, and they don't. There is one person that signs off the contractual relationship, and of course that goes to the largest person. If you are a tenant, your landlord is the one signing it. So this is about evolution, not revolution. Landscape recovery is great, but let's have landscape recovery for all of England, not some of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Secretary of State announced, as you'd have seen at the Oxford Farming Conference, that the first round of the revised SFI will be for small farms only, in an effort to tackle the imbalance in who's getting the lion's share of the previous round of allocations. What challenges do you think that's going to pose for actually rolling it out? And what do you think we could be doing to better target the SFI to make sure it gets where it needs to go?
I'm really sympathetic to the challenge that DEFRA faces, which is the fact that it doesn't have enough money to do what it wants to do. But I think it has been a long-established principle within agri-environment schemes that we invest in every hectare. So there's a short-term challenge to resolve with the SFI, which they are trying to resolve with the budget that they have. But we must get back to a place whereby we are investing in every hectare. I think that's really important. Otherwise, you're back to more diamonds. You'll have these little pockets that are working. Nature is across the whole country. And so we shouldn't penalise anyone. We should be prepared to make sure that we are investing in every hectare. And that's what I believe should happen. Can I just say that it would be very easy to say, well, we've got so much going on now, we're going to leave this to the next Parliament. We must develop the changes now before the multi-annual plan is written for the next Parliament. The Permanent Secretary in DEFRA is the one that writes the multi-annual plan, and that will dictate the funding and indeed the proposal for the next Parliament. So it's really important that we recognise the challenges that DEFRA has, but that we see those changes happen. And again, I think this committee has a really core role in making sure that is implemented now so that we develop the change for the next Parliament.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Just lastly, we know that at the moment it's our dairy farmers that are at the real sharp end of global price fluctuations. I know that your farm, I think, is beef, sheep and arable, so I won't ask you to comment on the specifics of that. But many have noted that when we had basic payments, they helped somewhat to level out some of those fluctuations in income, and therefore build in some resilience that isn't there now, particularly if your farm is not in an ELM scheme. How do you think DEFRA can address that issue of support during times of real crisis to make sure that we don't just keep losing farms every time we have these cycles?
Well, it can't at the moment. It doesn't have a budget to deal with a market failure situation. So in that situation, it would have to use emergency measures and call on the Treasury for a fund. Similar with disease outbreaks. We don't have a plan for how we manage risk in a market failure situation or in a disease situation. And we should have. So you've got a different approach in the devolved nations. But one of the challenges of saying we are going to follow the environmental route alone and allow the market to provide in the food producing area doesn't allow you to do that. So again, that is the need for bringing food into all of this. And the active farmer principle, that is taken out of the legislation in the Agricultural Act. I think it is personally right, on the evidence that I saw, that we focus on the people who are earning a living out of farming. There are many people that might well have, sold their tech business, bought land for tax purposes in many examples, but they are not farming that land. They are not reliant on farming for a living. DEFRA knows exactly who is farming. We have more regulation probably than any other country in the world. They know who's farming. And so we should be focusing that investment in those that are producing the nation's food, because that is also a way of dealing with food inflation that we're facing into as well. So I just think, there's a few things that need to be done that will deliver the outcome that we're looking for.
Some have said we should treat farms like any other business, and if they can't cope in, the harsh world of the global market, then I'm sorry, but they're just going to have to go under. You're saying quite clearly that we should treat them differently. There is, inherent value in preserving our own food production, and that's something that the government should be looking to do in times of crisis.
Well, I think it does depend on what you want. We do have, broadly, the average farm on the DEFRA analysis is 140 hectares. That's pretty small. If we want those farms to survive and be profitable, so if we want them to thrive, then we have to look at how they thrive. And there are various different things that we can do. We're seeing livestock prices, beef and sheep, be remarkably resilient. But that is two things. Demand is there, supply is tightening, and those are critical to profitability and keeping price where you want it. So, if we look back to COVID, we saw people eating mince and only mince, and we saw chillers filling up with prime cuts and steaks, and price fall very quickly on the back of it. The same impact will happen with trade deals. If we start to import a lot more strip lines and prime cuts from Australia and other countries, price will fall because it will displace Irish. And so you have to balance these things very, very carefully. If you don't want your smaller farm businesses, if you want big monoculture businesses, do nothing, and that is what you will get. I don't actually believe anybody wants that. So if we don't want that, we've got to act with a plan that builds what I think we all want.
Thank you, Chair.
Henry, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, we sort of touched on the fact that a lot of what Josh has alluded to is the brainchild of Dieter Hellman, Michael Gove. And you've talked about what do we want. Do you think you know what the government, what DEFRA wants?
We got, obviously, a different government. We are in a different world to the world that we were in when the principle of public monies for public goods was established and the Green Brexit that Theresa May proposed. And so I think we've got to be very agile to what has happened and to what do we want to be. What is this country? What do we want to be and where do we want to go and how do we want to get there effectively? I think successive governments over many years have not understood rural. And I think that's a big problem. And I think even more so, the machinery of government, our civil service, Whitehall, does not understand rural at all. And that needs to change. And I think that's incredibly exciting because I think rural is very much part of growth. I was really struck when I spoke to the Forestry Commission and, you look at the government plans for housing and they said, where is our plan for timber? We have no plan for commercial timber at the moment. A lot of our firewood is being imported from Belarus in the last Parliament. It's not rocket science to work out that actually if you had a coordinated plan within the UK for what we were growing here, what we needed here, we would have a huge opportunity. But at the moment, it's not a joined-up plan at all. So I think we have to have a radical reset from where we were then, because what was set out in the Michael Gove, Dieter Helm era was a growing public purse and a growing public investment. And that era has gone. We've got to look at how the private market comes into all of this and, how we deliver on a plan for the whole country. And so I think there's got to be a lot of lessons learned. And at the moment, DEFRA is very much set up in that era. But it can and it will. And I think it's very keen to adapt. You've got a new permanent secretary who I think is very keen to change the way DEFRA operates and what it delivers, because there's a pressing demand for it to.
That was a masterclass in diplomacy, given the question you were asked. Can I just touch, before we move on to planning reform, you mentioned there your surprise when you spoke to the RPA about the cost of administration. We can obviously pick that up with the RPA ourselves, but are you able to share with us anything it was that you were given that surprised you so much?
Well, I was struck when I spoke. This was
the move from basic payment to SFI.
Yeah. Well, I was really, and I do think this is why the committee is so important, because so much is dependent on the questions that you ask. And I was really struck with the RPA when I asked the questions about deliverability of the SFI and deliverability of the land-based payment, because Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have chosen to continue delivering via a land-based payment. And of course, we did get to know how that operated. There were many challenges and the government faced fines over many years because we weren't delivering on time. But the RPA said that they had less than 200 people in the end working on the land-based payment. With the SFI, they had over 900. So within a year on deliverability, the manpower shift was enormous.
Under 200 to over 900. Okay, we'll perhaps return to that at some point. Charlie, you're going to lead the question on planning reform.
Coming in today, you mentioned earlier about that aspiration to increase exports by 30% and grow domestic production. Is that in any way possible without reforming the current planning system?
No. I mean, if I'm honest, I'm appalled at the situation that we're in on the back of what we've done. So it's not rocket science to work out that if you lower stocking densities, you want a slower growing bird, to deliver that animal welfare, you need a larger building. And what should have happened in the last Parliament was a join-up with animal welfare and environmental protection with our planning system. So we have, in the last Parliament, undermined our own producers because we have insisted that they have a lower stocking density and they have a slower growing bird, talking about the poultry sector rather than the pig sector, although the same implications apply. So when you've got a growing demand, and there really is now with the cost of living crisis, there is a growing demand for affordable proteins, and we are now importing a lot more poultry meat on the back of this legislation and regulation. It can be solved immediately by a planning framework that will allow permitted development rights to increase the building size by 1,000 square metres. That could be done tomorrow. And that should have been done in the first instance in the last Parliament when the legislation went through, because not only are we penalising our own farmers, but we are not doing justice to animal welfare and environmental protection. These new buildings will allow for much better facilities, and we're being penalised for it. But then you look at why, you realise that all of the process is in DEFRA and the leadership is in HMCLG. So it's no wonder when you get to a local authority level that advice is in one place, infrastructure is in another, and none of it is joined up. So what I'm saying to DEFRA is there are two things: permitted development rights for larger buildings, but also individual wind turbines and on-farm reservoirs could all be done through permitted development rights. But then you need also to develop a blueprint for planning so that we can have new buildings delivering better outcomes that go through in a very similar way. And I do the comparison with energy, because it's appalling at the moment how much it is holding us back. It's disadvantaging consumers, it's sucking in more imports, and it could be rectified. And I'm pleased that DEFRA do seem to be well on the trail of rectifying it.
Yeah, I mean, you hear anecdotally of sort of hundreds of millions of pounds stuck in the planning system currently. Before we get to the point where we might reach reform, the current situation on the ground obviously is patchy geographically from local authority to local authority. How much of that do you think is because of poor interpretation, guidance from arm's length bodies such as Natural England? How much is that stifling it at the moment? And should there be guidance from MHCLG to say to local authorities, you actually need to get this sorted and get it pushed through?
So they need, I believe, a blueprint, planning for food, I talk about in here, that streamlines all the processes you refer to. So Natural England, the Environment Agency, the Forestry Commission, all of it is held back by arm's length bodies who are set up within their process. But what it does is cost an enormous amount of money, take a very long time, and sometimes does not lead to anything positive at all. And local authorities, you know, when we look at the remit of a local authority, you know, with economic growth, they don't have that direct relationship with farmers. And of course, this goes back into the establishing the agri-growth hubs and the closer relationship with farmers at a local level that I believe is really needed when you're looking at economic growth plans, of which planning is held back. And then it all grinds to a standstill because, you know, often you'll have a national approach to just blocking planning permission, bypassing the fact that this is going to be better for animal welfare, it's going to be better for the environment. There is nothing not to like, but it's just the system that is failing it at the moment.
The amount of money that goes into the rural economy as a result of building new buildings and everything else, you know, it's not good for the economy, so it does desperately need to be sorted. Is your aspiration, therefore, that the blueprint would form part of the land use framework when we eventually get that from DEFRA, or are those conversations separate, and are you confident that we'll see this reform planning move forward quite quickly?
Certainly, it seems there seems to be a totally different mood music. And of course, the help here is that Steve Reed is in HMCLG now, and nobody knows these challenges better than Steve Reed. And indeed, when I saw him the other day, he said he was very keen to join it up. But we've been a long time, you know, we've been many years where this has been failing. So it needs to be reformed in totality. And I still think permitted development rights, you know, when we're looking at reservoirs, turbines, the ability to make a building larger, that should happen immediately. The wider challenges on planning definitely need to streamline it so that MHCLG have effectively an oven-ready blueprint that local authorities can use. If you are the local authority at the moment, not only is it very, very difficult and costly for the person applying for planning permission, but for the local authority, it's equally confusing and costly, and that is what I hope can change, but it will only change if we get a Whitehall established approach.
It seems to be a no-brainer because it's not going to cost the government vast amounts of money. It costs parliamentary time and Whitehall time, but apart from that, you know, it's going to free up huge amounts of money.
Totally. It's a classic example of a process that is really holding back growth and opportunity.
Just very briefly, Chair, just on the issue around protected landscapes and national parks, etc., do you see that as a slightly separate carve-out when it comes to this planning reform, or would you like to see farmers within national parks also be free to do these permitted developments?
I think we've got to understand that farms are, you know, over millennia, they have evolved. We can't set anything in aspic. And so much as we want to preserve the heritage and the culture of our national parks, we want those farms, we want those businesses to have the same benefits, you know, of buildings that are fit for the modern age, rather than just set in stone of the past. So I think it's about making sure that we have the plan that is joined up in all areas that delivers, you know, on the outcomes that are needed.
Thank you very much.
Keith Rowley, thank you. Moving on then to questions around supply chain fairness. Sarah Breakfasting.
We've already discussed that farmers and growers need fair dealings within the supply chain to survive and thrive, and food resilience should be recognised as a public good. The review recognises the power imbalance between producers and the rest of the supply chain, and the resilience of the food system really depends on securing critical supply chains from end to end. So what are your key areas of concern for supply chain fairness, and how can these be addressed?
I think it's the parliamentary journey that effectively all sectors need to go on is really important. And I think for the pig sector, that has been really important, what has come out of it on fairness, on long-term relationships. The arable sector just started its journey through Parliament. But it's not about one thing. So when we look at the Grocery Code Adjudicator, the GSCOT, the Ombudsman, I recommend that the Grocery Code Adjudicator should come into DEFRA, because twice now we've nearly lost it in TBT. It's paid for. It's not a cost to the department. I recommend that it is expanded. The threshold is reduced from 1 billion. So that it goes to all businesses purchasing over 500 million, that the golden rules are enshrined in law. We've got to make it fit for purpose for the age that it is working in. I think it's done a huge amount of good. Mark White following Christine Take-on, I think we've been very lucky with the Grocery Code Adjudicators that we've had. They can open the door into any retailer, but it's important that they can spread, I think, into the out-of-home sector as well. I've noticed I've had a bit of pushback in the grocer, the model that looks at the regulation around the golden rules and the reason for enshrining them in law that seems to be getting resisted. That was the unanimous feedback from everybody that fed into me. So from the NFU and others, they were adamant that this needed to happen. And indeed, in my time at the NFU, I did speak to a lot of businesses that were very nervous about getting involved for fear of being delisted. So that nervousness is still there, and we've got to give suppliers confidence that they can engage with the process, and that will be acted upon. So I don't think we should underestimate the progress that's been made, the good job that's been done, but I do think now we need to go to the next level. It seems to make complete sense, if we're looking at market monitoring as a whole, that we have the Ombudsman working with the GCA, so that we can really deliver on all of this. And that shouldn't be a concern or a worry for anyone, but I think it would be better placed in DEFRA to deliver what's needed.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to be an effective system? And if so, how effective do you think it's going to be? And I'm just kind of thinking around the voices of farmers, and you've already said that some just simply won't go because they're scared of the implications of making a complaint, and then also the number of small farmers' voices being drowned out by those big industry players. We know that farmers often receive less than 1% of in terms of money, in terms of what they produce. So there's these kind of pushes and pulls, isn't there, from both ends of the supply chain. And we know in the middle there's some companies that are getting very rich as a result of it. Do you think the government has got the confidence to really deal with this issue, both for the benefit of farmers and for consumers?
Well, I think that's why the threshold should be changed to 500 million from $1 billion, because that will bring more in. They are expecting that, so that should most definitely happen. And we have to accept, and I've always been struck by the lack of understanding of our competition law, which is so prohibitive to discussing price. And I can remember at the Food Summit that Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, organised at number 10 Downing Street. Dres Coffee was very keen to have a conversation on price with primary producers, farmers and growers and retailers in the room. There is no way that conversation could happen. And they were very quick to say, we cannot have that conversation without a lawyer in the room. And I make the point about the largest fines in history that were basically because a few pence, processors and retailers were trying to get a few pence back to dairy farmers, and it was deemed to be collusion in the marketplace. So this is a really, really difficult one to resolve because of the wider structure that we have. I didn't speak to, because of time, the Competition and Markets Authority, which I would have liked to have done, because I think they are set up to look at this through the lens of the consumer, which is why those fines came about originally. What we don't want is the consumer being disadvantaged because we have less British produce on the shelves, because our marketplace, we aren't able to have those conversations around price. So what we want is to be able to have those open conversations where people feel they can discuss price, they can discuss the relationships. And, I'm very mindful of the pressure on buyers at the moment to drive a good bargain. We've got to make sure this is an open conversation whereby everybody has confidence. And that government, which will be DEFRA, feels that it can intervene if necessary.
So on that basis, do you think the single regulator is preferable?
I think you're looking at change across the whole area. So, market monitoring is really important, that you've got the information. And the horticultural sector feels really strongly that they need that information every 2 weeks. Other sectors won't be quite so focused on timings, but we need to do all of it rather than some of it. So there are lots of different things that need to be part of this. The Ombudsman, the adjudicator, the market monitoring, making sure that the parliamentary journey for all sectors happens. There isn't one part that you can reform that will deliver on the rest of it. You've got to do all of it.
So just on sectors, really pleased to see that the sector missions in there, and particularly the horticulture strategy, which is fantastic to see. And I've already spoken to so many people who are so pleased to see that. But there isn't an absence of focus on the organic sector. And the sector doubled since 2010. It's growing, but yet our land production has remained relatively static at about 3%, I think. So it feels like I suppose that tells us that we're satisfying that market through imports. And I feel that we need to focus on that sector a little bit more. So why is there so little mention of organic and perhaps no call for an organic action plan?
So I think it's very important that the sector missions establish that themselves, so that every sector is focused on the market opportunities, because for some there will potentially be a bigger opportunity for organic than there will in other sectors. But I would like to think that is going to be part of those sector missions and the subsectors as to looking at what the market wants, what the opportunities are, not just the opportunities at home, but the opportunities for exports as well. But, the fundamental point with organic is the price premium, and we've got to be focused on those price premium opportunities for them. And, of course, I think quite a lot of concern around conversion and what the opportunities are going to be, what the government ambition is for organic farming going forwards.
Yeah, just on that, the EU is an average of 10% land in organic production and a target of 25%. Scotland is committed to doubling land area. And then we've got Ireland has set a target of increasing coverage from 1.6 in 2020 to 10% in 2030. So it shows that it can be done. So should we and to bring that price point down, we've got to be able to develop a roadmap to encourage, because we know that there is a market there, but obviously rather than bringing imports in, we should be producing home-grown organic food to help sustain that market.
Yeah. We should, but I also think we've got to look at the challenges of sustainable food production, and what does sustainable food production mean, and how do we put a floor effectively into achieving sustainable food production. So if I'm honest, I put the bulk of my focus on that because it is legislated for. We are going to have things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming in. That is going to be a tax on primary producers. It's not going to be reciprocal to what we're importing. So I think the real goal in all of this, of what I was trying to set out, is how do we maintain or grow production but decrease impact and decrease cost. And that is what I have set out. Now, for organic farming, they play a big part in all of that. But there just simply wasn't the time or the remit to go down into specific areas.
Thank you. And then lastly, climate change is already one of the biggest factors that's undermining profitability in farming. We know it's not going to go away, it's going to get worse. There's little or no mention in the report of the need to move away from conventional farming practices, which, as we know, exacerbate some elements of this. What are your thoughts on the most effective ways to support farmers to ensure that they have resilient farms and businesses going forward?
Yes, I have to say I dispute that WWF said a similar thing, which I absolutely dispute, because I think this report is totally focused on that. I mean, I talk about the absolute need for commercial research projects to scale our ability to dry and pelletise waste nutrients from not only the challenges of sewage sludge, but also dairy slurry, poultry manure. You know, we've really got to look at how we scale drying and pelletising and providing those green fertilisers. We've got to be establishing a standardised baseline of how we measure, you know, on soil health, carbon, biodiversity and water, a standardised approach on that. So I think there's a lot in here that is about reducing our impact, but it is also about, you know, growing more with less impact, with less cost. And that is fundamental to the whole journey of meeting net zero objectives. But it's what I've tried to cover off is the how this is done and what needs to happen. And the fund, you know, that's why it's so important that this commercial research happens. You know, we've also got the issues of microplastics. We need these scale projects at a national level to do this, but also within the sector missions, we need to be using the opportunities around research and innovation. You know, we have the agri-tech centres as part of the industrial strategy, but we don't have farming or food production as part of that. So I see a really critical role with the UK Agri-Tech Centre, of which Steve McLean, formerly from M&S, is now the new chief exec. I think they have a huge role to play in working with AHDB TIA, which is about CPD and skills, to bring this together, to see if we can get everything in one place, on research, on advice, very much following the Chagas way of working in Ireland, because that, to your point about decreasing impact, is the only way we do it. But we must allow farmers, that's why the 2 years is important. You know, I'm conscious I'm talking about a levy investment. We must allow those sectors to define what those research priorities are as well, rather than mandate them. It would be totally wrong for me to have come in and said, each sector should be doing this. They've got 2 years to develop that.
And finally, we've spoken about national herd, national yield, to be able to benchmark properly. What are your thoughts around establishing one system for a carbon audit, so that we know we've got that benchmark around carbon, and also then standardising that carbon market? Yeah,
that's essential. That's why I talk about a standardised approach to baselining. We've got to accept that there's got to be investment. We can't leave that cost on those farm businesses. There's got to be investment in that. We've got to put a floor. We've got to put a financial floor in that sustainability, and that's why we've got to look at this economic solution, effectively, of how we deliver it. But a standardised approach. Scotland has committed to one calculator. I would like to think that actually within the UK we could commit to one calculator. That would take us a lot further forward. So the standardised approach is critical, and we've got enough evidence now that we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we're going to move on to questions around animal welfare and trade. Jenny, you're going to lead off, and then Tim will come in.
Thank you, Chair. Before I kick off on that, can I just thank you for your report, thank you for being here, and particularly the conversations that you had pre-Christmas with number 11, number 10 about APR. And I'm sure that you were a very powerful voice in the chorus of voices that made the good decision happen just before Christmas, so thank you for that. Can I ask, in that kind of context, before I lead into animal welfare, you obviously were asked, you were commissioned to do this by Steve Reed, you were appointed by Steve Reed and asked to do this, and from the journey from when you were asked to when you delivered the report, did you feel the winds shift towards the importance that the highest powers are placing upon agriculture and concerns that they might have had? Did you feel those shifting winds during that period?
I mean, I think Steve Reed deserves a lot of credit for establishing something that was really, really important that nobody else has asked in my lifetime. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for asking that question. I know that he faced opposition to asking it, let alone to getting me in to do it. So even more credit to him for holding on to that. I didn't detect from I don't detect from anybody in government that they are trying to see less farming. Far from it. I do think there have been some long-term institutional challenges that aren't particularly the fault of anybody, but it's just the way we've been for a very long time. And that needs to change. And I think we're on the road to that changing. In my experience, my time involved with the sector, apportioning blame, being angry, doesn't normally lead to any positive outcomes at all. So I think we need to establish a new way of working. I always had access, and I said from the very beginning I would need to have access to number 10. And in fairness to the Prime Minister, if ever I wanted to speak to him, I could speak to him. So I think there is an ambition to deliver. I don't underestimate the challenges that there are, but I'm confident, and I think through this committee that has the ability to hold everybody to account, we can see change happen.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it is a brilliant piece of work, as I'm sure you've been told many times. But that evidence-led approach, I think, presents some undeniable facts as well that I think will resonate, no doubt, with not just DEFRA, but I mean more specifically Treasury and other departments as well, because you highlighted some of the issues about cross-departmental working and Treasury not always speaking the language or hearing the right language. So I think from that perspective, it's hugely welcomed. We're moving on to animal welfare, as the Chair said. So the animal welfare strategy and your report almost landed at the same time. To what extent were you involved in or consulted on the development of that strategy? Were you aware of things that were going to be brought forward through the animal welfare strategy when you were writing this? And what's your assessment of the animal welfare strategy in its realm?
So it's fair to say I didn't have any involvement in it at all. I wasn't briefed on it at all. So there was no correlation between the two things. If there's a nervousness from my part, it's on these trade deals and what we're expecting, and to the points and discussion on planning earlier. We've got to do this in a joined up way. That doesn't mean we're raising the bar once again for farmers here and importing food, whereby those food values are not part of those trade deals. We don't have sensitive sectors. So that would be my nervousness on it. We've got to have a fair approach to trade with our own producers and imports. Core standards has been a big ask with the evidence that I've had. So a lot of people saying, we must have core standards. I think in my conversations with DBT, that is going to be very difficult to establish, which is why I talk about the scorecards, the market monitoring, the being more ambitious to join it all up. We've obviously got the Trade Agricultural Commission and the work that it has done, and I talk about implementing that. So that would be my nervousness. I didn't have any involvement with it. I haven't had since, and I want to see a sort of common and fair approach and a joined up one across the 4 countries as well.
Yeah, thank you. You talked earlier about, I think you may have alluded to it rather than explicitly said it, but our higher welfare standards mean we have a great export market. We have a product that people want to buy, and that's in large part down to our higher welfare standards as well as the brand of UK. So there is a lot to be said for that, though I totally appreciate the risks that come with importing low welfare goods as a means to access cheaper markets when we have higher costs for delivering welfare. Would you have any advice to government on what support farmers could receive in order to move forward with some of these higher asks on animal welfare? So if we're requesting and bringing up standards in welfare, which comes with a financial burden, is there a conversation that we should be having with government about short-term support, financial support, in order to help those farmers achieve that?
I mean, if you were talking to the poultry or pig sector here today, they would say resolve the planning situation and we're fine. So I think sorting out the situation with planning would allow our producers to supply our home market in a way that we know the demand is there. You've got all of the retailers saying we need more poultry production in the UK. We know that already we've got standards that sit above, pretty much every country in the world. We've raised our standards since we left the EU, but we haven't done the same with imports. And therein lies the concern for me. We must have a fair approach with this. Otherwise, we will just undermine our own producers and they will be producing a niche product. And we saw this happen in Sweden. Sweden is a classic case in point of where they raised standards of animal welfare and all they did was import more German product on the back of it. And now, in light of everything that's happening, you're seeing a Swedish farming minister with a very, very different attitude to food production and saying, actually, we need to be producing more here in Sweden. We need to be ambitious on farming and food production. So that has got to be the approach, that this is joined up and part of a wider plan rather than a press release. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Jane and then come to Tim.
My question was, sorry, I'm late. I've been at a bill committee, so I do apologise for coming in so late. So if I ask you something you've already been asked, please tell me. I will try not to. My question was going to be quite similar, I think, to what Jenny has just asked about the voluntary proposals and whether you thought farmers would take those up, the voluntary welfare proposals in the strategy, or what incentives they would require. But I think you've just answered that and said that rather than financial incentives, they would be looking at relaxing the planning system, that kind of thing. Is that right?
You're not so much relaxing the planning system, just making sure that it does deliver on those animal welfare outcomes that are required. Look, if this was streamlined, I think we're already there. We're already doing it. Without doubt, buildings are holding us back. Yeah. And that could be sorted out pretty quickly, and that would make a massive difference.
The other thing I wanted to quickly ask, which you might already have covered, is the manifesto target of public procurement, 50% public procurement. Could that be a part of the solution here, do you think?
Definitely, and that's why I talk about those 4 markets. And when I was responding earlier, I talked about the need to be focusing on retail, out of home, government procurement, and exports. Government procurement has been talked about for a very long time. I find it extraordinary that we can't pick up what we did in the London Olympics. whereby we had an across-the-board British sourcing strategy. We actually used Red Tractor assurance in order to be able to do that. That is state aid compliant. So in the last Parliament, there was a lot of concerns that you couldn't be talking about British. We wouldn't be compliant with state aid regulations. We know all of this. We know it inside out. You know, there are ways to talk about British, embed British, that are state aid compliant. So Red Tractor is completely state aid compliant. It was established within the EU. We were, in fact, the first country back in 2000 to establish a wide-scale assurance scheme. And it's really frustrating to me that we haven't been able to deliver what seems to have cross-party support to have British within our public sector. We've got great initiatives like the Lincolnshire Food Partnership that I refer to, but we need many more of them.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, I think you've touched on this twice now, the tension between SPS and animal welfare, both with Jenny and actually earlier in the session. And you mentioned India, and I know with the Australia deal as well, big differences around cattle transportation, pig production, all sorts of variances. I mean, how do we stop government from allowing SPS negotiations to undercut farmers on that aspect, welfare? What do you think we could do differently?
I don't think a lot has changed in the Department of Business and Trade with the ambition from the last Parliament to this Parliament. I think a lot of that stems back to that 0.6 figure that I talked about. If you have a part of your economy that you don't see as valued, then why would you take it seriously and embed it in your trade discussions? So it's very important that we join up better understanding of the ambition, and that's why it's so important that DEFRA can do this on behalf of farmers, because DBT doesn't know farmers, it doesn't have a relationship with farmers, it doesn't talk to farmers. And I still think there is this feeling that actually, imports, ingredients, they can come from anywhere and we can export them. So I think that is embedded in the system. And that's why we need to sort of take a step back and say, well, actually, if we understand better the trade-offs in all of this, the plan and the strategy will be different. But that isn't there at the moment. So we've got to recognise a lot of trade deals have been done. We've got a liberalised relationship with Australia and New Zealand. We've got the Trans-Pacific relationship. We've got India. We've got the US. Imagine if we had in 2020 a fully liberalised relationship with the United States. That would focus the mind now. So I think the world order has changed. We have to recognise food security as national security, but those are not words on a page. That is about action. And what does that action and that strategy look like? I'm conscious that, I think the Department of Business and Trade has seen the industry as protectionist in the past. I was certainly nervous in my conversations with them. But I think if we join this up, you will have a different attitude. And if there is an ambition, and there must be, to be exporting more, then actually they will come to see the primary producing sector as a massive ally.
And I understand the importance you're saying and making sure that the sector and the importance of the sector are recognised, but with your previous hat on, you were very critical about those trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, because actually the level of consultation, I think I'm right in saying, wasn't considered to be up to scratch. It was actually more the sector was being told what was happening rather than being invited to be a partner in setting out the negotiating position. Do you think that's still the case in how we approach these trade deals and negotiating them, that we're not consulting properly enough with the sector beforehand as to what our position should be?
So this all goes back to the machinery of government. The Prime Minister asked me about, he wondered why they didn't take farmers on their trade delegation to India. When we did the Australia deal, my opposite number, Fiona Simpson, was over here. The same with the New Zealanders. We had Zippy DeVell, who's Tom Bradshaw's opposite number, was in our Parliament for a week. And the Prime Minister was very keen to change that and take farmers on trade delegations. So we've not done it. And in the last Parliament, I think there was, the situation with Australia was an absolute travesty. We'd taken back control, but we gave control away completely. And that wasn't about not doing trade deals. Trade deals are a good thing. But you want the ability that if anything is going wrong, or you're flooding your market in any one area, that you can do something about it. So the importance with Australia of leaving the safeguard measure in, of balancing the carcass, not just sending us the strip loins, was a really important safeguard measure to leave in. But, the line had been that Australia saying, well, we're fully liberalised, and we gave all that away. And that was a big mistake. So I think things are a bit better now, but the damage was done then. And I would love to think that we would establish a way that core standards were embedded, sensitive sectors were embedded. But at the moment, there is simply not enough understanding across government. The NFU has called for a task force to be brought together to look at that. You've really got to understand the value of a sector if you're going to do that. Back to my point with the ONS.
Thank you.
Do you think the lessons that we learned from the trade deal with Australia are being implemented in the SPS negotiation with the European Union? Or are you not close enough to it for that?
I still go back to that, SPS is predominantly about food safety and biosecurity.
But engaging the sector, though, as well.
Engaging the sector, there is not the relationship that there should be, which is why I talk about, establishing the agri-growth hubs, the catchment approach, having many more farmers involved with setting the plan and direction. And no, at the moment there isn't, and that's why the national plan and the local plan need to be far more aligned. I asked the New Zealanders if partnership was important, and they said, no, it's not important, it's essential. Nothing works unless you have that.
I think we may well be responding to that, but in the meantime, Henry, you've got some questions in relation to finance.
Thank you, Chair. We've touched on this gap in respect of DEFRA not having the money that it needs to or wants to in order to deliver on its priorities, and you've touched a lot in your review about private finance. I was just sort of taking a step back for a second and thinking, I want to ask the question whether it's because of the realities of the public purse that one should be looking at private finance to plug this gap, or whether it's something that if you were to take away those pressures from the Treasury, which I appreciate is a reality that perhaps may not come to pass, but if that was to happen, is your position still that private finance should be there and should be leveraged in the way that you've identified through Soil Shot and the Nature Task Force?
Yeah, the reality is the reality, isn't it? That the claim was made that this is what we've got to deliver and this is how much it's going to cost. And, the Treasury has not given DEFRA any more money. You could go into, and I have touched on, what I think were wrong decisions that have probably put the Treasury off spending. The fact that we had an open-ended budget, we didn't know what the demand would be, we didn't know then what it was going to cost the taxpayer. So I should imagine the Treasury was quite nervous about increasing funding to the SFI without changes. But I think we've got all of this legislation. If you look at the Environment Act, if you look at the Environment Improvement Plan, we've got a big expectation about 70% of land in England being actively engaged. And there is a cost to that. So there are choices. You could repeal the primary legislation that embedded it. I think that would be very ill received and would be a retrograde step. So how are we going to fund it when financial institutions, corporate businesses are being requested to disclose their nature impacts, and they are being required to be reporting and investing in the solution. But at the moment, we're looking at a lot of very small-scale projects, a lot of greenwashing that is going on. And we've got a lot of challenges around affordability. So you've got great things like BNG, but you've got very expensive credits. So to my mind, you need to be looking at affordability for corporates so that they're not seeing yet another cost in all of this. You need to be looking at a really comprehensive audit where we know what is happening on our farms, if we're planting a herbal layer, if we're planting a cover crop. So it's a real opportunity to create something that is real, that is not greenwashed, and that delivers for everybody. So I think, the corporate world wants this. It needs to do it. It needs it to be affordable. And farmers can provide the two things. Farmers and government, actually. Government can provide the integrity, and farmers can provide the scale and the delivery, because they can carry out what is needed to deliver for nature at a landscape scale. You cannot do it without the farmers. And I think it is wrong to keep thinking we can just put more and more money into the nature reserves. We need to think, actually, we've got to expand our ambition on landscape recovery across the whole country. And the other option is setting up the Fed groups that I talk about in here. We've had huge success with cluster groups of farmers coming together and collaborating. We've had huge success with farmers developing. I was given evidence by the Environmental Farmers Group, which is a trading platform, effectively a big cooperative of farmers that's looking at trades on water quality and biodiversity. So there were lots of options put forward to me. I just think we want to make it fair to everybody across the country. And we can't keep relying on the taxpayer to fund all of this. We've got to look at these private markets and how they invest in a way that is beneficial to them as well. So this isn't about a tax. This is about a market that operates and delivers for everybody.
Do you think that we've touched on some of the dangers that, in respect of the government subsidy, where that's rewarding the larger farms in terms of their capability to access that money? And if you've talked about the difference between that local and the national, so the local farmer perhaps not having the access to capital to access those grant schemes. So do you think that there's a danger that the reliance on private finance might end up perpetuating or exaggerating these differences between the larger estates, larger landowners, and those small family farms that you've talked about?
Well, at the moment, that's what's happening, because the larger you are, effectively, the more money you can pull down. So we want to make this fair to everybody. And there's different ways that you could do that. I said at the beginning I felt it was important to invest in every hectare and not create this difference between, well, small should have and large shouldn't. I think investment in every hectare is going to remain fundamentally important to delivering on the outcomes that we want. But when we look at what we've got at the moment, it is unfair. The larger you are, the more money you get. Well, the decision in the beginning was to change that and make it fair for everybody. You could have also not be farming at all, have and buy a large estate for other reasons and be pulling down taxpayers' money to deliver nature benefits. Is that right? I mean, there are lots of questions that come on the back of this. What I've tried to do is deliver on those government priorities and to deliver something that's fair for everybody. And that surely is the best way forward.
What do you think the government should be doing in the space of that private finance?
Well, that's why I asked Emma Reynolds to establish this task force to look at it, because she ended the green taxonomy, which was predominantly about a standard of how we would deliver on green finance options on TFND. So the green taxonomy is ended. So she's in a very good place to work with the NFU, the CLA, the IGD, the financial institutions to say, okay, how do we bring this together and what does it look like? Because we know the banks desperately need this, the corporates desperately need this, but they need those two things. They need integrity and they need scale. And the government can do that, but I go back to, we need farmers involved. This isn't just about investment in protected landscapes and nature reserves. We need the whole country involved. And that is what I think makes it exciting, because that gives you your financial instrument to be able to put that floor in profitability for your smaller farming business. If you don't do that, if you say, well, we haven't got enough money to have an SFI anymore, we're going to expect farmers in England to just operate in the market, but we've got that legislation there, so we expect them to be delivering for the environment as well. It's not rocket science to work out on the evidence that I have. It's undeliverable. You know, you've got the mid-tier farmer who is producing 65% rather of output, farming, 57% of land area, and they're not profitable. I mean, only in the top performing farms over 5 years, only 8% of those farms are profitable for 5 years in a row. And there are two critical things for them. One is an efficient business, but the other is scale. And there were many efficient businesses that did not have scale, so were not profitable. So profitability is absolutely at the heart of environmental delivery. And I've talked about, which I won't go through again, the importance of food production being built into this. But if we don't establish a new economic model on the evidence I have here, we are going to see change that I don't believe we want.
On the one hand, we've got a Secretary of State who's a former city minister, so clearly has a grasp of some of this. But on the other hand, we've got a department which in many ways, to come right back to the start of our discussions, is quite limited. Do you think the department has the capacity to do something of this sort that is really quite innovative and creative, novel for civil servants?
I think obviously this very much involves the Treasury as well, but you look at what it would do for unblocking the challenges on infrastructure and everything else. So yes, it does need to look across government. I had many conversations with the financial sector, with analysts, with the Bank of England, all of which will be important in developing this new model. But I think for too long, we've had a centralised focus on the City of London. We need to expand that focus and really see the opportunities across the country, because you know it isn't just about relying on taxpayers. This is about a fundamental reset of farmers being able to provide what the market is demanding, and making it a national asset. You know, we are at that juncture. Do we want nature as a national asset? Is it important to us? I think the answer is yes, it is. I mean, who is going to be out there saying, no, it couldn't matter less? If it is important, if it is a national asset, it has to have a value that is not a commoditised value. And that way you deliver your compliance with your legislation. Otherwise, you just drive a way that is reliant on the taxpayer funding it.
Henry?
Just, do you think there's, in terms of having a national asset funded by the government as opposed to a national asset owned by an Australian private equity company, for example, do you think, do you see any, does that?
So at the moment, on offsetting requirements, you know, there are effectively, you know, we've got a lot of people offsetting their challenges, whether they're a private equity business, a celebrity, whoever they are, they can buy up land and pull down taxpayers' money to do nice things on that land. What I'm saying is we have to have, I think, a far fairer approach that delivers on that for everyone. So I think, you know, private equity businesses as a whole, you know, it depends on what you want. You know, if you want large areas, which we are seeing, large areas of land taken out of production, that is what we'll see more of. But if we can allow those farms to be delivering the nature requirements, and we put a value on nature, which we can only do by mandating the Task Force for Nature Disclosures, which is a global ambition, then surely you know, that is a good thing to do it through those farm businesses. I mean, it doesn't matter really whether you're a farmer here or a farmer in Kenya. Surely we want to keep multiple benefits coming from our land rather than just taking land out of production, and others who potentially aren't even living here or paying taxes here benefiting from it. But we've got to create that economic model rather than just look at it or just ask for it or just think that the taxpayer will pay for it. You know, we've put the legislation in place, now we need to make that market work.
Renee, that's been a tremendous and quite comprehensive canter around the various issues in the review. So thank you for that. I think you've given us plenty of material here to work with. I'm struck with the fact that you think we've got 2 years to get this right. So it's within the lifetime of this Parliament. And the way we as a committee work is one which has our always open inquiries, the future of farming being the most relevant to this one, but others on supply chain fairness, for example, would also come into play. So thank you for identifying us as an important part of this process going ahead. I think having identified that role for us and the timescale that you've given us, it might put the placeholder in your diary for 2 years, and we shall revisit some of what we have spoken about today. But for the meantime, can I thank you for your attendance, thank you for your engagement and the work that you have done. It is potentially one of the most significant pieces that we've seen for quite some time, and I don't think there are many other people who could have produced it at all, let alone in the time frame that you did. So thank you for that, but that concludes the proceedings for today. Order.